Today for Bio 102, we are going to start Unit 11 on ecosystems and communities. So what are ecosystems? They're going to be a community of biological organisms plus the non-living components with which those organisms are going to interact with. It's going to consist of two essential elements. They're not found just in obvious places like ponds and tropical rainforests, but also in some unexpected places like this back of a beetle would have an ecosystem. So with these two different essential elements, you have what's known as the biotic environment. It's going to consist of all the living organisms within an area, and it's often going to be referred to as a community. The abiotic environment is often going to be referred to as an organism's habitat. So this is going to be the non-living part. Biotic's the living part. So with the non-living part or abiotic environment, it's going to consist of two components as well. It's got chemical resources of things like soil, water, and air. So you'll see things such as carbon dioxide and nitrogen and phosphorus, which are going to play important roles in these types of environments. And you'll also see physical conditions. Things such as temperature, salinity of water, moisture, whether in the air or in the soil, humidity, which is that moisture in the air, and energy sources. So biologists are going to study two main aspects of ecosystems. And when they do this, they're going to monitor what's known as the inputs and the outputs of these ecosystems. So they'll trace the flow of energy, for example, of various molecules as they're going to be captured and transformed and utilized by organisms. And then later, they're going to exit that system or they're going to be recycled. And so how activities of one species can affect another species is going to be another thing that biologists are going to look at within these ecosystems. And so you can have two types of relationships there that they study, for example, like the conflicting relationship, which is the predator-prey, or you could have the complementary relationship, which would be like flowering plants and pollinators. So a variety of biomes are going to occur around the world, and each is going to be determined by temperature and rainfall. So in order to determine the biome, you need to know what the average temperature of that area is. You need to know what its average rainfall or other precipitation it might have, such as snow. You need to know, is the temperature relatively constant or does it vary seasonally? And is the rainfall relatively constant or does that also vary seasonally? So biomes are going to be large ecosystems covering huge geographic areas. And with this, like we said, you're going to look at temperature and precipitation that's going to dictate what these biomes are. So they're going to have primary productivity levels, and they're going to have the amount of organic matter produced depending on what type of biome it is. So numbers and types of primary producers. You're going to have chief determinants of the amount and breadth of other life in this region. So we have terrestrial biomes. They're going to be defined and described by a predominant type of plant life in the area, and they're determined by weather. So 4 questions, like we said, you always ask what the temperature is, the rainfall, precipitation, and all the different things that are going to help determine exactly where you're at with these biomes. So knowing these answers makes it possible to predict what type of biome is going to be in that area. So temperature and precipitation, like we said, dictate that primary productivity level. Primary producers that we're going to find would be things like grass, trees, and agricultural crops. These are going to be chief determinants of the amount and breadth, like we said, of other ranges of life in that region. So you have these 9 different types of biomes. You have your tropical forest, you have the desert, savanna, temperate grassland, deciduous forest, and that's the one that we're in, by the way, a chaparral, a coniferous forest, the tundra, and then the polar ice. So looking here, we see the aquatic biome. With the aquatic biomes, it's going to be determined by a physical feature that includes the salinity of water. That's going to be the salt content that you find there. Water movement, and depth. And so it's going to have 5 distinct types. You have the lakes and ponds, and that's going to be the non-flowing freshwater. You have rivers and streams, that's going to be flowing freshwater. You have estuaries and wetlands. These are going to be areas with saltwater and freshwater that mix together in shallow regions. You have open oceans, which are going to be deep saltwater, and coral reefs. These are going to be highly diverse and productive regions in shallow oceans. So physical forces are going to be interacting here. They create weather. Global air circulation patterns create deserts and rainforests. So weather is going to create different climate zones and biomes and characteristics each, which are going to be influenced by several different factors. The first factor we see here, we have the curvature of the Earth. So the sun shining directly on the equator is going to help spread out the heat over a smaller area, and it's going to cause warmer temperatures. Sun shining towards the poles is going to cause heat to spread out over a larger area, and that's going to cause cooler temperatures. And so this is how it's going to influence the different temperatures depending on what part of the Earth it's in. So this curvature of the Earth is going to cause different global air circulations. That's going to result from temperature gradients that are created by this and influences rainfall patterns in the 4 regions. And so here we see with the formation of rain, air is going to be heated, and as it's heated, it's going to rise. Then as rising air cools, it's going to condense, and so that cooling air is going to lose moisture and come back down to Earth as precipitation. Now with the global air circulation, you're going to have 4 different pattern regions. You're going to have the equator region, you have the 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south region, you have the 60 and 60 south, 60 north, 60 south, and then you have the poles. So let's go over each one of these. So right around the equator, you're going to have an area in which the greatest warming power of the sun is going to hit the Earth. So when the solar heat hits the Earth, it starts to heat that air. Warm air is going to rise, and it gets farther and farther from the Earth, and then it cools. Because cool air holds less moisture, clouds are going to begin to form, resulting in rainfall. And so this is going to create very wet areas. And this is where you're going to find things like your tropical rainforests. Now looking at the next, we're coming up or coming down. So you see the 30 degrees north or 30 degrees south on this picture of the globe. You're going to have high cold air at the equator expanding outwards. And so the cold air is going to fall downward toward Earth. Air is going to become warmer as it gets closer to Earth, and then that warm air is going to be able to hold more and more moisture, making it less likely to rain. It's going to help create an area with very little rainfall. And so the ground's going to get dry, and then we're going to have deserts forming. And so you can see that in the picture above, that desert formation. Now, if you go to 60 degrees north or 60 degrees south, going either up a little bit or down a little bit, you're going to have air falling at the 30 degree north or 30 degrees south, and it's going to hit the Earth and spread towards the poles. So air moving over the Earth's surface is going to absorb radiated heat, and it's going to get warmer. That warm air begins to rise, and then it starts to cool as it rises. Clouds begin to form, and that results in rainfall again. So we're going to have huge temperate forests that are going to form in these areas. And like I said, we live in a temperate forest area. Then you go to the poles. You could either go to the North Pole or to the South Pole. Here, air around the 60 degree north or 60 degrees south is going to expand outward. Cold air is going to fall downwards towards Earth. Air becomes warmer as it gets closer to Earth. That warm air holds more and more moisture, making it less likely to rain. And it's going to create an area with very little rainfall. There, the ground's going to be dry, and you're going to end up with what's known as a very cold desert or a tundra. So we have local topography that's going to influence the weather. Topography is simply going to be physical features of a region. It can include features that you find naturally, or it could be features that are created by humans. So 4 different features that you're going to have that are going to influence things are going to be things like high altitudes, rain shadows, asphalt, cement and building roofs, and tall buildings. So with these, for example, the high altitudes are going to have lower temperatures. They have increasing elevation and air temperature will drop. Weight of atmosphere becomes lower as the altitude is going to increase. And then as the air pressure decreases, the temperature is going to drop. And so let's say 1,000 meters above sea level, it's going to be 6 degrees Celsius in temperature drop. Next, we go to like a rain shadow. This is what you're going to see in this picture here. So you have wind that's going to blow in from the ocean towards land, rising, and then it hits the mountains. When it hits the mountains, that rising air is going to cool and it's going to hold less moisture. And so it's going to lead to cloud formation and rain. Now the air presses over that mountaintop and then it falls, becoming warmer, and then increases in moisture that it can hold. So it reduces the rainfall on one side, and then you're going to have all the rain on the other side. We see this a lot in our area in Virginia, where we see the snow, for example, in the winter move across the mountains. So one side of the mountain will end up getting a lot of snow, and then we live on the other side and we don't get as much snow. And so this is why our area gets less snow than the other side. So is it warmer or is it going to be cooler in urban areas relative to nearby rural areas? Well, it's all going to have to do with the materials that we use in our urban areas. It's going to have to do with what we call urban heat islands. So for example, things like asphalt are going to be able to hold in a lot of heat, and then they release it slowly throughout the evening when it cools down. Why is it so windy on the streets of tall buildings? Well, with this wind, it is actually going to blow across as those temperatures are going to be hotter from the asphalt. It's going to create the current, which is higher up, to blow through there and actually create windy streets. So with these modern landscapes, we see the asphalt, the cement, the building roofs. They are known for absorbing heat, and it's going to raise the temperatures. Like we said, it creates those urban heat islands. And basically the sun energy is going to hit that concrete, it hits the pavement, it hits the roofs of the buildings, it hits that asphalt, and it causes them to heat up. It's that rising warm air is then going to alter rainfall patterns in and around those cities. And you can see in this picture, it shows you the hottest sections. Back for a second. With the tall buildings, they're going to be responsible, like we said, kind of for those continuous winds, because the buildings actually are going to deflect strong elevated winds, and it's going to push that wind kind of downwards and doubling or tripling that initial speed. Ocean currents are going to be able to affect the weather. So we're going to be able to see this in global patterns of circulation in the ocean. So oceans are going to contain several large circular patterns of flowing water. These are going to be influenced by wind, Earth's rotation, gravitational pull of the moon, temperature, and salt concentrations. And so here you see those different large circular patterns that are going to be flowing. And you're going to see how these different currents are going to be created. So we have the warm ocean currents, and you see how they will fall, and you end up with cold ocean currents that will push up or push around. So why do beach communities have milder weather than the inland communities? Well, it's going to be water's ability to absorb and hold heat is going to be one of the biggest things. So it's going to have the greatest effect on weather in these areas. So as, let's say, the summer months are coming on, that water is going to be cooler from the winter. So it takes a while for that water to heat up. Once that water heats up and you start to go into the fall or even late fall, it's releasing that heat energy. And so as it slowly releases that heat energy, it's going to keep that area a lot warmer on into the start of winter. So beaches on the east coast of the United States have warmer water than west coast beaches at the same latitudes. Why is this? Well, one of the strongest ocean currents is going to be the Gulf Stream. It's going to travel north through the Caribbean, bringing warm water up from the east coast of the United States and then across the Atlantic Ocean towards Europe. So because the current begins to warm part of the globe close to the equator, it's still going to be warm when it reaches the east coast of the United States and then as it travels to Europe. So this warm water also is going to warm the climate in these areas as well. In fact, if it weren't for the Gulf Stream, a lot of Europe, given its high altitudes, would have a climate more like Canada's. But because all ocean currents in the northern hemisphere rotate in a clockwise direction, water reaching the beaches of California, unlike water reaching the East Coast beaches, is going to it just comes from the north near Alaska, and that's why it's going to be very, very cold there. Lots of you have heard of El Nino. This is going to occur every 2 to 7 years, and it's going to be blamed for flooding, droughts, famine, and a variety of other extreme climate disruptions. So, with the normal conditions, a steady wind is going to blow westward across the Pacific from South America towards Southeast Asia. These winds push warm surface water away from the coast of South America, and it heats the air above it, which is going to cause that air to rise and produce tropical storms. Off the coast of South America, colder water upwells from the ocean depths, and that cold water is going to cool the air above, and it's going to cause extremely dry weather. And so water from the depths of the ocean is going to bring rich nutrients, enabling plankton to flourish and to feed huge populations of fish. This is going to be under normal conditions. So El Nino is, like we said, occurs every 2 to 7 years. So that normal South America to Southeast Asia winds are going to ease up just a bit. And so without a push of the wind, warmer water flows back towards South America. The cooled water around Australia and the Philippines is going to cool the air and cause dry weather that can lead to droughts. Without the warm surface water being blown west, that cold water from the ocean depths cannot upwell. And so if that happens, then that warm surface water is going to warm the air and results in rainforest. Here with no upwelling, notice that that water is not going to bring up nutrients, and plankton levels are going to drop dramatically, and then fish stocks could be actually wiped out. You also have what's known as a La Nina. That's going to be where ocean surface temperatures are going to be lower than usual, and it's going to result in the climate effects that are going to be opposite of El Nino. Right. Energy and chemical flows within the ecosystem. So here you see energy flows from producers to consumers. So the pathway is going to begin here with the sun. Most of the energy is going to be absorbed and reflected by Earth's atmosphere or surface. About 1% is going to be intercepted and going to be converted into chemical energy through photosynthesis. Energy is then going to be converted to chemical energy and continually transformed by living organisms. And so here we see that the main organism, the primary producer, is going to be the plant. So it's capturing about 1% of that sun energy and converts it into glucose or starch through photosynthesis. You're going to have your primary consumer come in, and it's going to be a herbivore. It's going to eat the plant that was able to harness that 1% energy from the sun. That secondary consumer is going to come in. It's going to be a carnivorous animal that's going to eat the herbivore. Then you have your tertiary consumer come in, which is going to be a top carnivore usually, and they're going to eat the other carnivores. So first up, we are going to talk about that primary producer again. So the plants, like we said, convert light energy from the sun into food through photosynthesis. Then we have that primary consumer, which is going to be the animal that eats the plants. These are called herbivores. And that secondary consumer is going to be an animal that eats the herbivore, and that's called a carnivore. And then you're going to have the tertiary consumer, which is the animal that eats the other carnivores, and that's called a top carnivore. So chains or webs, which one's the best to use? So if you're discussing a food chain, it's going to be a pathway from photosynthetic producers through the various levels of animals. Food webs are going to involve harvesting energy from multiple stops in that food chain. So looking here, we have the decomposers and the detrivores. Decomposers and detrivores will break down organic waste. They release chemical components that then can be reused by plants and other primary producers. The stuff that they break down, for example, the detrivores break down, is going to be referred to as detritus. These can include things such as bacteria and fungi for the decomposers. With the detrivores, these are organisms also that are going to break down and feed on once living organisms. They're going to include things such as vultures, worms, and arthropods. Both of these groups are going to be responsible for breaking down organic waste. Like we said, they release chemical components that can then be recycled back through other animals, or it can be recycled back through producers. So energy flows, we have losses at every stop in the food chain. One of these main losses is going to be heat. Heat's a usable energy lost as energy flows from one stop to the next in this food chain. And so inefficiency of energy transfers is often going to be lost as that heat. Energy pyramids are going to reveal inefficiencies of food chains. It's actually only going to be about 10% efficient. With biomass, we have what's known as the 10% rule. Only about 10% of what you take in is actually going to be used as energy. So where does the rest go? Well, the other 90% usually is going to be expended in cellular respiration, or it can be lost as feces. So in humans, why is vegetarianism more energetically efficient than meat eating? Well, that's where that 10% rule applies. You're going to be able to take in more nutrients for the biomass than you will be with meat products. So why are big, fierce animal species so rare in the world? Well, it's actually going to be due to this biomass or 10% rule, because we're going to have less species that are able to consume the amounts of meat and things that they need in order to keep their bodies going. So here, looking at that energy pyramid, is basically going to be a diagram that illustrates the path of energy through organisms of an ecosystem. So like we said, only about 10% of biomass from each trophic level is going to be converted into biomass in the next trophic level. So this is going to explain why there's so many more plants than animals, and why top carnivores are going to be relatively rare. So you have the bottom part, so you have the large portion, 10% converted into biomass. You go to the primary consumer, you're taking another 10%, goes to the secondary, another 10%, and then the tertiary is going to be a 10% of that. So we're going to smaller and smaller amounts. There can be different variations in primary productivity. So you have what's referred to as a large base pyramid. This is going to support relatively large biomasses of consumers. This is going to be common in rainforest, marshes, and alga beds. Then you have what's referred to as these small-based pyramids. These reduce the ability to support consumers. And so you're going to find this common in deserts, tundras, and open oceans. And the third one is going to be an inverted pyramid. These have small biomass of producers that support relatively large biomass of consumers. This is going to be common in some aquatic ecosystems where plankton are going to be primary producers in those areas. So essential chemical cycles are going to go through the ecosystem. We need these chemical cycles in order for everything to be able to recycle and to grow properly. So chemical flow, like we said, is going to be cyclic. They're going to cycle around and around within that community. So each chemical is going to be stored in a non-living part of the environment. Organisms are going to be able to acquire the chemical from the reservoir. That chemical is then going to cycle through the food chain, and eventually the chemical is going to be returned to the reservoir. So with the food chains, for example, plants and other producers are going to take up molecules from the atmosphere or from the soil possibly. Those chemicals are going to move into the animals as they consume the plants and other animals. Things such as detrivores and the decomposers are going to return those chemicals to the abiotic environment, and this is also known as your molecular recycling. The chemical reservoirs are going to be a non-living part of the environment where the chemicals are going to be stored. So organisms can acquire these, like we said, from the reservoir. They have chemical cycles as they go through that food chain, which we just talked about, and then they're going to be returned again. And so 3 important chemical cycles that we're going to go over are going to be carbon, the nitrogen, and the phosphorus cycle. Now with the carbon cycle, that's going to involve, of course, carbon, and we say anything that is living contains carbon, or we refer to it as organic. And so the carbon cycle involves carbon. It's going to be found largely in 4 compartments on Earth. We find it in the ocean, atmosphere, terrestrial organisms, and fossil deposits. Oceans are actually going to contain the most of Earth's carbon. And so it's going to go through a 4-step process. Plants are going to use carbon molecules from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, and they're going to use light energy from the sun to build sugars through photosynthesis. Carbon is then going to move through the food chain as organisms eat plants and are themselves eaten. Organisms are then going to extract energy from carbon bonds and exhale carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere as a byproduct. When large numbers of organisms die, carbon accumulates in the ground, and over time, organic remains can be transformed into coal, oil, and natural gas. Burning coal, oil, natural gas all release large amounts of carbon dioxide back into our atmosphere. So why are global CO2 levels rising? Well, they say it is going to be due to fossil fuel use. We use these fossil fuels in almost all of our mechanical processes, from running factories to creating electricity to running water sometimes, and especially within our cars to get from place to place. So global CO2 levels are going to be rising in general, but they also exhibit a sharp rise and fall within each year. Why would this happen? So although on average the level of CO2 in the environment is increasing, there is a yearly cycle of ups and downs of carbon dioxide levels in the northern hemisphere. This cycling is going to be due to the fluctuation in the ability of things such as plants to absorb carbon dioxide. Many trees are going to lose their leaves each fall, and during the winter months, relatively low rates of photosynthesis are going to lead to low rates of carbon dioxide consumption. And this is going to cause an annual peak in atmospheric CO2 levels. But during the summer, leaves are going to be present, sunlight's going to be strong, and photosynthesis is going to consume that CO2, and that's going to occur at a much higher rate, and that's going to take that CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's why you're going to see cycles each year. Going into the nitrogen cycle, of course, this one involves nitrogen. It's going to be found largely in the atmosphere. And the atmosphere is actually made up of 78% nitrogen. So when you breathe in oxygen, you're not just breathing that oxygen in. It contains other gases there as well. The nitrogen that we breathe in, we cannot use within our body. We actually have to take it in through food sources. And so as we breathe it in, it's then going to be breathed right back out. It doesn't actually go into our system. And so with this, it's going to be necessary to build things such as amino acids and precursors of other nitrogen-containing molecules that are going to be critical to life. But remember, we don't get that from respiration. We have to take it in through our food source. So most nitrogen is going to be completely unusable. Like what I just said, that atmospheric nitrogen is going to consist of 2 nitrogen atoms that are bonded tightly together. Bonds need to be broken to make nitrogen usable for living organisms. With this, we have things such as nitrogen fixers. Soil-dwelling bacteria are going to be responsible for chemically converting or fixing nitrogen in a form of usable nitrogen for plants. Once it's able to be put into the plants, then we could take that plant in as a food source and get our nitrogen from the plant. This is going to occur in a 4-step process called nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen gas is going to be fixed by soil-dwelling bacteria producing ammonia and other nitrogen-containing compounds. Nitrogen-containing compounds are further modified by other bacteria in a form that can be taken up by plants and used to build proteins. Nitrogen is then going to move through the food chain as organisms eat plants and are themselves eaten. Nitrogen is going to be used by each organism to build new proteins. Animal waste and dead animals and plants are going to be broken down by the soil bacteria that convert nitrogen in tissues back to nitrogen gas. And so the nitrogen gas is then going to return to the atmosphere. Nitrogen is like a bottleneck limiting plant growth. For example, these fertilizers. Why is that? Well, it's going to be because it's necessary for the production of every plant protein that there is. And so because all nitrogen must first be made usable by bacteria, plant growth is often limited by nitrogen levels in the soil. So for this reason, most fertilizers containing nitrogen in a form of usable by plants. So that's why we add those fertilizers in. Next, we have a phosphorus cycle. That's going to involve, of course, phosphorus. Found largely in the soil, it's necessary for every molecule of ATP and DNA that's going to be made. Phosphorus is chemically converted or fixed into a form that's going to be usable by plants, which is a phosphate, and then absorbed through their roots. So when we use it for ATP, it's actually going to be the 3 phosphates in the ATP molecule where the energy is going to be stored. And then within the DNA, remember you have a sugar phosphate backbone, which is going to be a strong backbone that keeps that DNA in order. That's where you're going to see the phosphates that you need in the DNA. So with the phosphorus cycle, what's going to happen is a 4-step process as well. Plants are going to absorb that phosphorus through their roots in the form of phosphate. Phosphates are then going to move through the food chain as an organism eats plants and then are eaten themselves. And then the phosphate's going to be used by each organism to produce ATP. Like we said, putting on those 3 phosphate molecules, the energy is going to be stored between that 2nd and 3rd phosphate for the ATP molecule, and then building DNA. And that's going to be found there within the sugar phosphate backbone. Phosphates then are going to be returned to the soil when dead animals are broken down by bacteria and other decomposers. An additional phosphorus is gradually going to be released into the soil as rock is slowly weathered. Another thing that's going to allow nutrients into different environments is going to be what's referred to as eutrophication. This is going to be the increase of excess nutrients dissolved by a body of water. And so here, excess nutrients is going to equal nitrogen and phosphorus. It's going to lead to rapid growth of things like algae and bacteria that are consuming that dissolved oxygen. It's going to result in a large-scale die-off of other organisms. Often, this is going to be attributed to agricultural runoff. Species interactions are going to influence the structure of communities. So interacting species can evolve together. We refer to this as coevolution. With coevolution, you're going to have concurrent appearance and modifications over time in certain traits of interacting species. So this can occur as a result of natural selection. It can cause organisms to become better adapted to their environment, and it does not distinguish between biotic and abiotic resources as selective forces. Either can cause evolution. So this kind of leads you, which one came first, the long-tongued moths or the long-tubed flowers? So like we said, it causes organisms to become better adapted to their environment and doesn't distinguish between living or non-living things. You're biotic or you're abiotic. So it's basically going to enable each species to become more adapted to others. Examples, you can have, like we said, that 11-inch long tongue of that moth feeding on the 11-inch long nectar tube of the orchid. So each species is going to have a role in a community that's going to be defined by its niche. So more than just a place for living, a niche is going to be a complete way of living. It's a way an organism is going to be able to utilize its resources of its environment, and it's going to have 6 main features. It has a space an organism requires. It's going to be the type and amount of food an organism utilizes. It's going to be the timing of an organism's reproduction, an organism's temperature and moisture requirements and other necessary living conditions, an organism's food resources and how it can attribute those and acquire those, and influence on competitors. It's going to actually help it to define each species' role in the community. We actually have 2 different types of niches. We have the fundamental niche, and this is going to consist of a full range of environmental conditions under which a species can live. Then you have what's referred to as the realized niche. This is going to be where and how a species is actually living. So competition can be hard to see, but it still influences community structure. So when niches overlap, when grown alone under a particular set of environmental conditions, each 2 similar paramecium species is going to thrive. But when both species are going to be grown together because of their niches will overlap, they're going to have to compete, and 2 outcomes are going to be possible. You can have what's called competitive exclusion, or you can have resource partitioning. Now, with competitive exclusion, that's going to be where one species within the niche utilizes resources more efficiently, driving the other species to local extinction. With resource partitioning, these species each are going to alter their use of the niche, and they're going to divide their resources between the 2. Character displacement is going to occur when natural selection reduces the competition between 2 species by producing an evolutionary divergence in one or both of those species. For example, we have the finches here. 2 finch species have a medium-sized beak when the species lived on separate islands. When the birds inhabited the same island, they compete for the same resources. So evolution is going to lead to a shift in the beak size in each species. This change is going to be called character displacement. Notice how the thicker bead is going to eat the tougher seed, and the small, thinner bead is going to be able to eat the more wheat-like grass. So why is competition hard to be seen in nature? This is going to be because some species, especially closely related species, are going to have similar niches. And so this can lead to conflict as they try to exploit the same resources. Predation is going to produce adaptations in both predators and their prey. Predation is the interaction between 2 species in which one species is going to eat the other. Most important forces shaping composition and abundance of a species in a community is going to be the predation. Why do exotic species often flourish when released into novel habitats, even though natural selection has not adapted them to this new environment? Well, predators are going to be potent selective force here. Organisms eaten by predators tend to have a reduced reproductive success. So consequently, in prey species, you're going to have a variety of features that have evolved, and they continue to evolve, that reduce their predation risk. But as prey evolve, so do predators. So this coevolution is going to be a sort of an arms race with ever-changing and escalating predation effectiveness adaptations, causing more efficient predation avoidance and adaptations, and vice versa. So in this light, basically, it may seem unexpected that the exotic species often flourish when released into a novel habitat, even though the natural selection has not adapted them for their new environment. So as it turns out, just as these species are not fully adapted to the new environment, they also have very few predators there. And so with a low predation risk, they often are able to flourish. Prey adaptations for reducing predation, there's going to be actually two broad categories that we're going to see. We see the physical and we see behavioral. So with physical defenses, these can include 4 different types. You can have mechanical defenses. You could have chemical defenses. You could have warning coloration, and you can have camouflage. So looking at these a little bit, with mechanical defenses, that can include things such as sharp quills, prickly spines, wings, tough armor, claws, fangs, and even stingers. With chemical defenses, it can include chemical toxins making prey poisonous or unpalatable for other animals. These can be found even in plants, not just in animals. With warning colors, these species are going to be protected from predation by toxic chemicals frequently. If they have those toxic chemicals, they frequently have evolved to have bright colors that are going to warn against their toxic chemicals that they carry. And they can help conceal themselves from predators. Camouflage is going to be an adaptation in which an organism has a specific coloration that's going to enable them to blend into their surroundings or their environment, so they're not seen. Behavioral defenses are going to include both seemingly passive and active behaviors, hiding or escaping, or alarm calling and fighting. So 2 different types. With your hiding and escaping, you could have many species that are going to excel in hiding or running. You can possibly get one that has an advanced warning or of impeding predators coming in and be ready for an attack. They can quickly and avoid predators this way. They can have a variation or a safety in numbers type of thing that they travel with. And they can travel in large groups, which helps reduce predation risks. You can also have alarm calling and fighting back. So a lot of species are going to consist of individuals that warn others with an alarm when there's somebody that is considered to be a predator in the area. This is going to be risky for the caller because they are likely to be the prey at that point. But it helps give nearby individuals enough advance warning so that they can escape. Mobbing predators to keep them from successfully completing their task is also a way that they can help influence this. So predator adaptations for enhancing predation. Predators have evolved certain adaptations to increase their efficiency, such as toxic avoidance methods, better sensory perception, and faster running abilities. Here we have an anglerfish. He's going to have that luminous structure that he's going to hang up above that's going to attract animals. And while the other fish are attracted to that light, it is then able to eat them. So why don't predators become so efficient at capturing prey that they drive the prey to extinction? Well, we have what's referred to as a life dinner hypothesis. Although natural selection leads predators with effective adaptations for capturing prey, the adaptations are going to be rarely so efficient that the prey are driven to extinction. The explanation for this is referred to as the life dinner hypothesis. It generally is going to hold true because selections for escape ability in the prey is going to be stronger than selection for capture ability in that predator. So when the prey, such as let's say a rabbit, for example, can't escape from a fox, the cost is going to be its life, and it's never going to be able to reproduce again. On the other hand, when the fox can't keep up with the rabbit, it's going to lose a meal. So it can still go on to capture prey and to reproduce in the future. So in other words, the cost of losing the interaction is going to be much higher for the rabbit than it was for the fox. So parasitism is going to be a form of predation. It's going to be a symbiotic relationship in which one organism is going to benefit while the other is going to be harmed. There's actually going to be two types of parasitism. You have ectoparasites, which are going to be parasites that live on their host. These include things such as lice, leeches, ticks, and mites. Then you have endoparasites. These parasites are going to live inside of their host, endo. And so that's going to include things such as worms and fungi. So the most unique feature is that parasites are generally going to be smaller than their host, and it's going to enable that parasite to have the ability to stay in contact with the host for extended periods of time. The most unique challenge, however, is going to be how to get from one individual host to another. Lots of times the host dies, the parasite dies. So they have to be careful with that. So they have to overcome challenges by means of complicated life cycles. So case 1, parasites can induce foolish, fearless behavior in their host. We have what's called a toxoplasma. That's a single-cell parasite that's found in rats. It's going to live as part of a life cycle in cats, and it's going to cause rats to lose fear of cats and become attracted to them. This leads the rat to be likely attacked by the cat. So rats and cats, rats naturally fear cats usually. Case 2, parasites that can induce inappropriate aggression in their host. So you can have a parasite that has evolved a surprising method to solve challenging problems, such as how to get from one individual host to another if it's going to kill its host. Rabies is a good example of this virus. It's going to induce what we know as a rabid behavior in animals that it infects, and that's going to be things such as aggression, foaming at the mouth, and that's going to help it actually to attack other animals and then spread that virus. In case 3, the parasites can induce bizarre and risky behaviors in their host. We have the lancet fluke. It's going to be a parasite flatworm that creates a zombie-like state for its host. It spends most of its life in a goat, but then it can infect snails with their eggs. So when these snails eat contaminated vegetation, the fluke is actually going to get into them. Ants also are then going to come and eat the snail, and the fluke is then going to infect the ant's brain, altering its behavior. Not all species interactions are going to be negative. Other forms of different types of interactions are going to be referred to as mutualism and commensalism. Non-negative species interactions, for example mutualism, is going to be an interaction where both species benefit. Commensalism is going to be an interaction in which one species benefits and the other neither benefits or is harmed. Communities can change or remain stable over time. Many communities actually do change over time. Succession is going to be change in species composition of a community over time. Generally, it's going to follow disturbances. So you can have two types. You can have a primary succession or a secondary succession. So first you have this colonizing community, first arrivals to a lifeless and soilless area. They're going to be good dispersers but poor competitors, so they're gradually going to be replaced. So this is going to be things like fungi, bacteria, lichens, and seeds are going to come in. So next we're going to see mosses beginning to grow and trap moisture, allowing seeds and other plants to germinate. This is part of your intermediate community. Then it's going to build up to small herbs that are going to then go to shrubs, and they're going to become shading out those mosses and herbs, and so they start to die out. Next is going to go to the small trees. They're going to grow and outcompete the shrubs. And then lastly, you're going to end up with the taller, faster growing trees that are going to outcompete those smaller shrubs. So with that first section, we had what was known as primary succession. That occurs with catastrophic disturbance. That's going to leave an area completely barren of soil and no life. And so we talked about those colonizers arriving to that lifeless soil or soilless area. They're going to be good dispersers. They're able to move away from the original home. They're going to be poor competitors, so they gradually are going to be replaced by others. And like we said, that's going to be made up of your fungi, bacteria, and lichens. Now moving into that secondary succession, that's going to occur with disturbances that open up a part of a community to develop and to grow with a species previously that was outcompeted by other species in the area. It's faster than primary succession because life and soil are already going to be present. Some species are going to be more important than others within a community. These species are often referred to as keystone species. So keystone species are those that have a usually large influence on the presence or the absence of numerous other species in that community. A keystone species' removal means species mix and the community changes dramatically. Other species removal causes relatively little change. So examples can include, for example, bison, sea stars, dam-building beavers, elephants of African savannas, and lichens in the desert. Preserving keystone species is going to be a very important strategy in preserving biodiversity. And that's going to finish us up for Unit 11 and Bio 102.